Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the One to Know podcast. I'm Joel Haas.
I'm Lyle Alenstein.
I'm Lexie Linderman.
Today, we're going to be talking about Penn State's newest commitment, the second one in as many weeks. And then we're also going to be touching on the recent Lift for Life event that the team had. We got to speak to Franklin, a bunch of the coordinators, and a few of the players as well. So we got a lot of that. Got some more insight into the team for this upcoming season. But we'll start with the team's newest commitment, Jameer Joseph, a four-star cornerback, which marks the second week in a row that Penn State picked up a four-star cornerback. So Terry Smith kind of in his bag right now. Lexi, I know you did the film review on him. What were you able to see from Jameer?
He definitely plays man-to-man really well. He's like an athletic freak. Still obviously some room for development. I mean, he's gonna be a senior in high school. There's definitely still room for improvement. I mean, he hasn't hit college yet. But he also plays basketball in high school, which I think contributes to that athleticism, and also makes it like he has really fast acceleration and he can catch up to just about any guy based off his film. And he also just does a good job with changing directions. I think that also comes from the basketball a little bit. And he can also elevate really high. I did watch some of his basketball tape that he like fully dunked as just like a 6 foot guy. And I was like, that's kind of crazy impressive. And you definitely see it in his football tape too. I mean, his timing on the ball is really well. So yeah, I think it's a really good pickup for Terry Smith and the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, I think that was a good pickup. I think obviously he played just 10 games in his junior season, but he had 7 forced turnovers, 4 picks, 3 fumbles, and he's a proven tackler. And I know that's Terry Smith. He's something he's emphasized a lot for guys that he's looking in his recruiting class. And I just think Joseph coming in addition to Darius Dixon, I think the cornerback class is looking solid. Up to 3 guys with Xavier Thomas rounding out the third. Obviously, Brandon Finney, he's going to make his commitment some point next week. And I think the cornerback class is looking good. I think Terry Smith's kind of proven it in his recent years that he gets the job done, guys he wants to go after.
Yeah, for sure. You look at the recent history, and you've got Joey Porter Jr., who was, one spot away from first-round pick. You had Kalen King, who was projected first-round pick at the beginning of the season, didn't end up that way, but still got drafted. So you've had a few guys obviously going to the NFL recently. And obviously that's kind of something that's going to attract recruits. We heard that from even the transfers as well, AJ Harris and Jalen Kimber. We heard that, part of what drew them to Penn State was just that, they have that track record of recently sending players to the NFL and having one of the best secondaries in college football. So yeah, I mean, it definitely a big pickup for Terry Smith. That makes 2, high profile blue chip cornerbacks added to Penn State's 2025 class. 247 actually has both of them as the top 2 recruits in Penn State's 2025 class. But when you look at other outlets, some of them have Alvin Henderson up there in the top 2 as well, which, according to Lyle, he'll be heading to Auburn soon. So I don't know how long he sticks around, but either way, 2 of the top recruits in Penn State's class, both cornerbacks. So obviously that secondary should be set for years to come. And that room actually just got a little bit more crowded, or less crowded, I should say, with Colin Dinkins making the move to safety. Kind of getting out of the room, which I guess makes sense considering the depth that they already have, bringing in the transfers and everything like that probably gives them a better chance at some playing time. But then kind of moving on to the Lift for Life, Lexi and I were able to make the drive in person and kind of see the event. We got a bunch of media. We got to speak to Franklin for the first time in a long time. And he had a lot of interesting things to say, gave his thoughts on the whiteout, did not confirm an opponent. It almost seemed like he was going to confirm it at one point, and then he kind of veered away and said he didn't want to give anything away, but he has a good idea of where it's headed. But yeah, he says he's been working, closely with Pat Kraft and a lot of the other administrators to kind of figure that out. But we still don't know yet. They haven't made anything official. Some other things he touched on, just kind of specific players that he thought were impressing him. He's obviously going to speak highly of everyone on the team. That's kind of his job as the coach, be the PR guy. But he did speak really highly of Harrison Wallace III. So I kind of want to bring that up to you guys. What are your expectations for Trey Wallace heading into this season?
Wide receiver 1 is my short answer. But I mean, if you want me to elaborate a little bit, I don't know. I think he's got some big play potential. I think he's got that rapport with Drew. He's been there, obviously dealing with injuries and stuff. But I feel like we touched on this a bunch. But So expectations going into last season that he could be that number one guy over Keandre Lambert-Smith. And I think Peach Bowl, you kind of showed it. He had that 4 catches, 67 yards, a touchdown. Obviously, I'm pretty sure the wide receiver group didn't get a catch to the fourth quarter, but it's new expectations. I know Marcus Higgins talked about at Lift for Life that they're plugging away, they're putting in the work, ready to block out the noise. Andy Coleman, he touched on that as well. And it's one thing to say it, I mean, because obviously they're going to boost up the morale, they're confident in their guys, but so it's going to be something we're going to have to wait and see come the season. But I think Harrison Wallace, I think he's going to be that guy. I think West Virginia right away, you're going to get a glimpse of that and just see what he can do.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we also already got a glimpse of it during the blue-white game. I mean, obviously it was all very vanilla, but even after that, Wallace put a pretty good performance. I mean, looked like wide receiver one. Obviously, Julian Fleming was on the opposite team. So, but Franklin said afterwards that they were really disappointed with Wallace getting injured last year and that they were expecting a big year from him last year. And so I think the blue-white game gave kind of a preview. And I think now with Franklin affirming what he said back in April, I definitely think that Wallace is poised for a big year. And I think it's kind of what the wide receiver room needs. They kind of need like a guy to like step out in front with Keandre Lambert-Smith heading to Auburn, obviously. So I think Wallace is gonna have a big year.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely poised for a big role, and pretty much anytime he's been healthy, we've seen good stuff from him, whether it's the spring game, whether it's the Peach Bowl. The problem is obviously just staying healthy, but it seems like he's definitely, that's added some extra motivation. Franklin was kind of saying that, he's more motivated just knowing the potential that he has and how he wasn't really able to show it last year, but, he really wants to this year. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see between him and Fleming who kind of emerges as Penn State's top receiver this year, because I think it'll be a battle between those two. And one of the other things that I think will help Lexie, you wrote a story about this at Lift for Life, but the running backs also have been kind of working to improve their abilities in the passing game, get better there. They were decent last year. I think Katron had like 300 receiving yards and Nick was probably around the 200, 250 range. So they were, definitely a presence there that you had to watch in the passing game, but I think they're working to be even more effective when it comes to that. And that can kind of take some of the burden off of the receivers and just kind of help out with those receiving yards. So maybe the passing game, set for an improvement next year, especially with help from the running backs. I think the receivers improving, and then the tight ends, we know what you have in that room, obviously a lot of talented pieces. So I think Penn State's offense, honestly, and for a decent improvement, as far as the receiving game, I honestly think there might be bigger questions at running back, just because last year we kind of saw a dip off in production. Do you guys think this season they're going to kind of, Katron and Singleton are going to bounce back to what we saw in that 2022 season, or do you think it's going to be closer to what we saw last season?
I think they'll definitely bounce back. I think that after their kind of dip last season, they're definitely more motivated. I mean, you see outlets everywhere not really projecting them to be one like the top running backs in college football. And Nick talks about it at Lift Live. He said, it's just bulletin board material. They get sent that stuff. They have a Long Boys group chat. Like they're seeing it. They're motivated. I definitely think they're gonna bounce back for sure. And I think Nick said at Lift for Life that he's faster now than he was when he got to Penn State. I think he said he runs like a 4.33 40 now compared to 4.39 when he got here. So I think he's faster. I think he's poised. I think he's ready to also prove that he's an NFL ready running back. I mean, he's eligible after this year, and so is Katron. So yeah, I definitely think it's going to be a bounce back year for them. I think they're going to be a huge part of the Nittany Lions offense.
I think in terms of bouncing back, I think it's going to be more of a collective effort from the two of them combined, because I think obviously this is kind of like an unusual situation in college football where they're in year 3 of being a 1A, 1B kind of running back situation. Obviously, right when they got there, when they were freshmen, they were contributing. Obviously, you had some Kayvon Lee action in there instead of Katron right away. But I think that Nick Singleton was the guy freshman year compared to him and Katron. I think Katron really showed that in a 1A, 1B sense. He was the 1A last year. I think Singleton had a bit of a dip in production. I know he put on weight, and Lexie just touched on, looked a little slower. Obviously, if he's running that 40 now, I think speed is a big thing for him going forward. But I think they're a really good 1-2 punch. Obviously, they've got the bulletin board material. Personally, I think they're one of the best running back duos in college football, aside from covering the team. But I just think that collectively, if they want to move forward, enhance this offense, I think they both need to resume their top tier production that they've showcased in the past.
Yeah, it's interesting that, Singleton has been putting up faster times than he has in the past, because that was already, I would argue, his best trait was his speed. And we kind of saw that when he broke out against Auburn. in his true freshman season, because we heard kind of leading up to that game, a lot of talk from Auburn fans, SEC fans, that Penn State wasn't ready to, head to an SEC stadium on the road in a tough environment, and they weren't going to be ready for the SEC speed. And then we see Nick Singleton running away from, Auburn's cornerbacks, just leaving them behind in the dust. And now he's even faster, which is kind of a scary thought heading into this year. So yeah, it seems like kind of across the team, the overall theme for the offense is just they're really motivated to prove people wrong and kind of bounce back. They're hearing all that negative talk, coming from last year, their inability to compete in big games, things like that. So, I mean, obviously, every team going into the year is going to be, highly motivated, things like that. But it seems like Penn State really, we've heard it at every media that we've had, every single time we talk to Franklin, every single time we talk to Kotelnicki, every single time we talk to, whether it's Higgins or Sider or any of the offensive coaches, it's the same message every time, right? It's we're motivated. We want to prove people wrong. We've heard kind of the hate that we've been getting recently based on last year's performance. And I think every coach kind of says that. Every coach likes to, say, they were doubting us. They were hating on us. No one thought we could do it. We saw this stuff with Kirby Smart that came out after they won the national championship, where he was supposedly telling his team that analysts were predicting them to go 7-5 that year. And I don't know what analysts were predicting Georgia to go 7-5 that year, but it's a thing that every coach does, right? Like they try to motivate their team. They try to find this hate that they can use to fuel the team. But I think for Penn State, it's genuine because it's not just something that's been mentioned once or twice. It's every coach, every coordinator, every player keeps harping on it at every media that we get. And the more you hear it, the more you start to believe that, I really think this team does have a chip on his shoulder. I really think that offense wants to prove people wrong. And even talking to some of the defensive coordinators, I've even heard, like I know Terry Smith has mentioned it, sometimes when the offense goes against the defense, during practice, when they're doing different drills, we see that the offense is starting to win more and more of those drills because we were hearing that last year, every time the offense went against the defense, it was the defense dominated. And that makes sense because, Penn State had a top 2 or 3 defense in the country last year. And obviously the offense was, I would consider pretty average. But then you're hearing this year, it's more even out. Now we have to wait and see if, maybe the defense regressed a bit from last year after losing so many pieces to the draft, or is it the offense rising, or is it some of both? I tend to believe it's some of both, but that was interesting. And we actually did get to see the offense and the defense go head to head at Lift for Life. It was an interesting event. I didn't really know what was happening. I don't think the players knew what was happening. But they were competing against each other in a few events. It was kind of fun to watch. I don't know if we can really take anything away from it, but we got to see them compete in a few events, tug of war, some relay races, things like that. They were like throwing med balls, things like that. One of the things that did stand out to me though, competition aside, was just how big Tony Rojas looked. We've heard about him putting on a ton of weight, and the first time I saw him, he looked even bigger than last time. So I'll have to check and see I think he's up to 240-ish now. And yeah, and he arrived, I believe he told us he arrived at 180, 190, something like that. And then his freshman year got up to like 225. So now I think he's up to like 240, which is ridiculous. Just the year-over-year growth
After
we've seen from him.
After the blue-white game, we were a bunch of the reporters, we were asking him about like his weight, where he's at, because they were talking about how he noticed we looked bigger, and he's like, yeah, I'm at 240 now. The roster has me at like 225. And he just talked about like, and everyone's like, oh, that makes sense. And he talked about he's a big Chipotle guy, and he said that's been a lot of the weight going through Chipotle. But he just talked about like that was a big point of emphasis for him during the offseason, put on weight, especially in that new expanded role with Abdul Carter moving down to DN. Obviously, I think he's going to be a big part of that linebacker group. But yeah, the guy's huge. I think I saw a picture of him next to Kobe King, who's not a slouch himself, but Kobe King just like there was levels to it with Tony. Looking huge.
Yeah, with Abdul moving to defensive end recently, it looks like, the door's kind of open for someone to step in as kind of the leader in that room. Kobe King, obviously a veteran, Dom DeLuca, a veteran. But I think Tony Rojas might make a push. Do you guys think he's kind of developed into the leader of the room, or does he still have some kind of work to do with some veterans ahead of him?
I think he still has some work to do. He definitely has to prove himself a little bit more. There are, like you said, Joel, there's a good amount of vets in that room. So, but I think he's definitely going to be a key piece of the defense this year. Like, I think A lot of their success is going to lie on, the linebacker room and how he performs. But yeah, no, not just yet. He has to prove himself just a little bit more.
Yeah, I think he's going to be a big fixture, just like in terms of his production. Obviously, he's going to be on the outside, so he's going to have to make up for that lost production from Abdul Carter. And he also showed it in the flashes last year when he got snaps, even in that garbage time. He was racking up turnovers left and right. But I think from a leadership perspective, you're going to have guys like Kobe King, Dom DeLuca, Tyler Elson, who have all been there for a while. And I also think, just from a linebacker perspective, I think you want your leader in that room to be the Mike position, just because like they're going to be calling out the plays, reading the offense and stuff. And I just think guys that are more experienced, like Kobe King, Dom DeLuca, that have been there for a while, being able to read opposing offenses, I think that's going to help from a leadership role.
All right. So regarding Penn State's offensive line, um, specifically the offensive tackles, both of them went to the NFL this offseason. So Penn State needs, two new starters to step in, but that's not necessarily a huge problem or something that I feel like the team is really worried about at this point, just because they've had a lot of guys who've cycled in over the past few seasons who have starting reps, starting experience, in Big Ten play at the position. So there are several guys actually who could step in to that role. I mean, typically when you see that a team lost both their offensive tackles, you kind of pinpoint that as, maybe a potential weakness. They're losing, their starters at that position. But for Penn State, I think you have 4 or 5 guys who are ready to step into that position. And that now gets a little bit more complicated with James Franklin clearing Drew Shelton completely heading into this season. He said he's a full go after missing spring practice. So that was a little bit of a question mark, but now he's, ready. So he jumps into that mix. So yeah, I think, again, 4 or 5 guys who I think are fighting for a starting role in that room. You have JB Nelson, who got some starts last year. He's played guard and tackle. You've got Javen Williams. Anthony Donko obviously is in there as well. And then the transfer Nolan Rucci from Wisconsin, a former 5-star Pennsylvania native who, didn't really play with Wisconsin apart from the bowl game. But, obviously they brought him in for a reason. They felt like he could contribute here. So there's several guys in that room, even someone like Alex Birchmeyer, who's only a redshirt freshman, but was a highly touted recruit, high 4-star. So just a ton of guys in that room. Where do you guys really see the offensive tackle position shaping up heading into the season?
Yeah, I think Drew Shelton, I think he's a lock for one of the tackle spots just because he started games his freshman year. And then obviously last year we went to more of a reserve role, but he appeared in all 12 games, part of the 2 deep. So I think he's going to be that one guy, especially fully cleared now. I think that's good for him moving forward come week 1 against West Virginia. And the other tackle spot, to me, I'm torn between Javen Williams and Anthony Donka. I like Donka personally just because he came in at that left tackle spot for Olu during the Peach Bowl, having not played there at all during the work he's got during practice and like when he was part of the 2 deep. And I just think that shows a lot of confidence in him for him to come in and replace Olu like that for a position he didn't have a lot of experience in. And obviously, we're going back to the PR, nothing but praise. But he's a guy that seems to come up a lot, especially when we talked with defensive linemen, just about guys on the O-line that have impressed them at the tackle spot, and his name always comes up. So I think I like Donka and Shelton, and I think Javen and Rucci are both going to get spots in the 2 deep as swing guys, just because there's so much depth right now and they don't really have a proven guy. So I think there's going to be a lot of figuring out come week 1 or 2 with the offensive line.
I'd have to agree with that. I think Donka and Shelton are definitely probably the most likely candidates, but I think, there's a lot of options, like you said, Joel. So I think we could see a lot of different mixes to begin the season. I think Rucci's definitely going to get a good chunk of playing time. They brought him in for a reason. He's a transfer. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see the different combinations they put to begin the year. But I think Shelton and Donka are probably the 2 that we're going to see the most.
But yeah, obviously when you lose both your starting offensive tackles and one of them is the number 11 overall pick, you're kind of anticipating a drop off in that room. And I don't know if we're even going to see that just because the amount of, players who are in that room, obviously that competition is going to drive them. And whoever comes out on top of that is probably going to be, a really good offensive tackle if you're coming out, on top of that talented group. And I think with the depth they had, you guys kind of touched on it a little bit. They have the option to kind of rotate some guys in and out, which they've liked to do in the past. And that depth, really gives them the ability to play a bunch of different guys and feel confident in playing those guys. And I think depth is something that's going to be really important moving forward. And Penn State's done a good job with their offensive line recruiting recently, which allows them to have that. And I think when teams are playing potentially, I think they can play up to 17 games now in the 12-team playoff. I'm gonna have to double check. I think you can play up to 17 games now, potentially, which obviously that's a lot of snaps. And in addition to that, you have, NIL, you have the transfer portal, both kind of seeing a rise now where teams are kind of players when they're not starting, if they're not in that starting rotation, they're usually a lot of them are looking for other schools, other opportunities to start. They're leaving, pretty quickly, and NIL allows, smaller schools to potentially lure in backups from bigger schools, things like that. So you see that a lot of teams are kind of losing their depth now, just because of, the portal, things like that. Everyone wants to start, obviously. And a lot of teams are kind of losing that depth. And then also in an expanded schedule, when you start to look at, potentially a playoff run for Penn State, not that I'm predicting, a deep playoff run to a national championship or anything. And that 17 games would also include a conference championship game, which I don't anticipate Penn State playing in this year. But just looking down the line, you're looking at some teams could play 17 games. And when you're looking at, a few extra games added on as well as less depth, that's going to become even more important when players start getting injured throughout the season. Teams are going to start seeing rapid drop-offs when the backups come in. So for Penn State, especially at a position like, offensive tackle where players are getting injured all the time, I mean, those players, every rep you're trying to defend against a 300-pound defensive lineman who's rushing right into you. Obviously, it's going to take a physical toll on you, and that's a position where you're going to see a lot of injuries. So having that depth there, I think, is really important for Penn State. And a lot of those guys can play other positions as well. We've seen some of them get, starts reps at guard or center, whatever it may be. So Penn State's offensive line, I think, is still in a really good position, despite losing a bunch of guys to the NFL, which I think will pay dividends heading into next season. That's it for today's episode. Thank you guys for watching the 1-0 podcast. For more football coverage, you can find us at psucollegian.com or on socials.